For decades, access to the financial system was considered untouchable, a given, a baseline of institutional life in America, even for those under investigation, even for those facing legal heat. But in the last 72 hours, that assumption shattered. A figure once considered immune to this kind of institutional pressure has been cut off, not fined, not sanctioned with conditions, cut off entirely, and the implications go far beyond one person. This is the story of how financial institutions, some of the most risk-averse actors in American power, made a coordinated decision that signals something far larger than a single scandal. By the end of this video, you'll understand what changed behind the scenes to make this possible, why it's happening now, and what it unlocks next in terms of legal leverage, political pressure, and institutional precedent. Watch to the end because the last detail changes how this story reads. Let's start with what actually happened. In a span of less than 48 hours, multiple major financial institutions severed banking relationships with a prominent figure previously considered untouchable by virtue of wealth, political connections, and legal insulation. This wasn't a slow drift, it was abrupt, coordinated, and it followed a pattern. First, a Tier 1 investment bank quietly closed accounts, then a second institution followed within hours. By the third day, access to traditional banking infrastructure, the kind that enables wire transfers, credit lines, and institutional legitimacy, had effectively collapsed. No public explanation was issued. No press release. Just internal memos and quiet exits. The figure in question, someone who had weathered previous scandals, legal challenges, and public backlash without losing financial access. Someone whose network of power brokers had always insulated them from this exact outcome. But this time, something shifted. The banks moved first, and they moved together. Here's what most people miss. Banks don't act on principle. They act on risk. For a financial institution to sever ties with a high net worth client, the calculus has to flip. The risk of maintaining the relationship has to outweigh the profit, the access, and the political cost of the break itself. And that's a high bar. Banks operate in a regulatory environment where their every move is scrutinized by federal agencies, the Treasury, the Fed, the OCC, FinCEN. They face reputational risk, yes, but more importantly, they face enforcement risk. So when multiple institutions move in concert, it tells you something shifted in that regulatory environment. Either the legal exposure became undeniable or the political cover evaporated, or both. This isn't about headlines. It's about how power actually moves. And what makes this moment unprecedented is the speed. There was no drawn-out court order mandating the cutoff, no criminal conviction forcing their hand. The banks acted preemptively, which raises the question, what did they see coming that made staying in business with this figure more dangerous than cutting ties? Let's rewind 3 weeks. Behind closed doors, federal prosecutors began quietly briefing financial compliance officers at major institutions. The subject, emerging evidence in an ongoing investigation tied to financial misconduct, potential money laundering exposure, and coordination with foreign entities. These briefings weren't subpoenas. They were warnings. The message was clear. If your institution continues facilitating transactions for this individual and the evidence we're building becomes public, you will be named, not as a defendant yet, but as an enabler. That's the kind of signal banks respond to immediately. Because in the world of federal financial regulation, being named in an enforcement action, even tangentially, triggers a cascade. Stock price hits, board scrutiny, consent decrees, years of monitorship. The cost of staying becomes exponential. So the first bank moved, and once one moved, the others had cover to follow. But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. This kind of coordinated regulatory signaling doesn't happen by accident. It requires intent at the highest levels of the Justice Department and Treasury. Someone wanted this to happen, and they set the conditions to make it inevitable. Now let's talk about what used to protect this figure and why it stopped working. For years, political insulation was the firewall. Allies in Congress, access to key committee chairs, donors with leverage over party infrastructure, the kind of network that makes investigations slow down, that makes regulators think twice. But over the last 6 months, that network began to fracture. Key allies distanced themselves, donors redirected funding, congressional cover, once reflexive, became conditional. Why? 2 factors converged. First, polling data showed that continued association was becoming a liability. not an asset. Swing district vulnerabilities made proximity toxic. Second, alternative power centers emerged within the party. Figures who didn't owe their rise to this individual, who saw an opportunity to consolidate influence by letting the collapse happen. In Washington, loyalty is transactional, and when the transaction stops yielding returns, the loyalty evaporates. So by the time the banks started receiving those regulatory signals, the political cost of defending this figure had already outweighed the benefit. The financial cutoff wasn't the beginning of the collapse. It was confirmation that the collapse was already underway. Here's where the mechanics get critical. Once financial access is severed, a defendant's ability to mount an effective defense begins to erode. High-powered legal teams require retainers, often in the millions. Expert witnesses, forensic accountants, media strategists, opposition researchers, all of it costs money, and all of it requires liquid capital. When banks cut you off, that liquidity dries up. Credit lines disappear. Wire transfers get blocked. Even routine payments become complicated. And prosecutors know this. There's a reason financial pressure is often applied before indictments are unsealed. It's a force multiplier. It creates desperation, and desperation leads to mistakes or cooperation. Now, we don't know yet whether this case will result in a plea deal or a cooperation agreement, but we do know that cutting off financial access is a classic precursor to that kind of negotiation. It's leverage, structural, compounding leverage, and the figure at the center of this knows it. Which brings us to the question, what moves are available when the institutional infrastructure turns against you? You'd expect a public counteroffensive, press conferences, defiant statements, allegations of persecution, and there has been some of that, but notably less than in previous scandals. Why? Because in this case, going loud carries a specific risk. It draws more attention to the financial details. And the financial details, based on what's leaked so far, are the most vulnerable part of the defense. This isn't a case where martyrdom works. This is a case where silence might be the only play left. But silence creates its own problem. It seeds the narrative. It allows former allies to distance themselves without pushback. It makes the collapse look inevitable, which accelerates the collapse. This is the paradox of institutional power under pressure. The tools that used to work, publicity, defiance, mobilization, become liabilities when the underlying exposure is financial and procedural, rather than political and ideological. You can't rally a base around wire fraud allegations the way you can around ideological persecution claims. And the prosecution knows that too. So what we're watching is a figure with fewer and fewer moves, operating in an environment where every remaining option carries compounding risk. Now zoom out. This moment isn't just about one person. It's about whether financial infrastructure can be weaponized, whether the system that enables commerce, credit, and wealth can be selectively denied based on legal exposure, political pressure, or reputational risk. And the answer increasingly is yes. We've seen it before in smaller cases: deplatforming from payment processors, debanking of controversial figures, but this is a different scale. This is a figure with institutional power, legal resources, and political networks, and it still wasn't enough, which raises the question, if it can happen here, where's the line? Here's the real story, the one that doesn't fit neatly into a scandal narrative. This isn't just about one person's downfall. It's about a shift in how power is contested in America, away from direct political confrontation and toward institutional pressure applied through financial, legal, and regulatory infrastructure. Think about it. Impeachment failed. Congressional investigations were partisan stalemates. Media exposure moved polls but didn't produce accountability. So the system adapted. It found other levers: financial exposure, regulatory enforcement, coordination between justice, treasury, and the private sector. This is what accountability looks like in an era where traditional political mechanisms are gridlocked. It's slower, it's less transparent, and it operates outside the electoral process, which raises profound questions about legitimacy, due process, and democratic oversight. Because here's the tension. If the formal political system can't produce accountability, if impeachment is too partisan, if voters are too divided, if Congress is too paralyzed, then power will find other channels. And those channels are less visible, less accountable, and more concentrated in the hands of unelected actors, prosecutors, regulators, compliance officers, risk managers. Is that better? Is that worse? Or is it just the reality of how modern governance works when the constitutional mechanisms break down? There's no easy answer. But what's undeniable is that this case represents a turning point, a moment where financial infrastructure became the enforcement mechanism for legal and political accountability in a way that feels both inevitable and unprecedented. And once that precedent is set, it's hard to walk back. So where does this go from here? 3 scenarios, each with different conditions and consequences. If the financial pressure becomes unsustainable, we could see a negotiated cooperation deal. The figure provides testimony, documents, or access to networks in exchange for reduced charges or immunity on certain counts. This would be seismic. It would implicate others. It would rewrite political alliances. And it would confirm that the financial cutoff was, in fact, the leverage that broke the case open. Watch for quiet meetings between defense counsel and prosecutors, sudden shifts in public tone, or strategic leaks suggesting cooperation. Alternatively, this could become a protracted legal battle, challenging the bank's decisions as politically motivated, suing for access restoration, filing counterclaims against federal overreach. This path is expensive, slow, and uncertain, but it keeps the figure in the fight and creates opportunities for delay, discovery, and narrative control. Watch for high-profile legal hires, civil suits filed in friendly jurisdictions, or public statements framing this as institutional persecution. The third scenario is the quietest. The central figure becomes legally and financially incapacitated, but the investigation expands outward, targeting associates, enablers, and secondary networks. This is the slow burn outcome. No dramatic trial, no televised reckoning, just a gradual unraveling of the infrastructure that sustained the power. Watch for indictments of financial advisors, accountants, or intermediaries, asset seizures, and civil enforcement actions that avoid a single high-profile criminal trial. Which scenario plays out depends on 3 variables: the strength of the evidence, the availability of liquid assets, and the willingness of former allies to provide cover or cut deals. Right now, all 3 scenarios remain in play. But the financial cutoff makes scenario 1, cooperation, exponentially more likely. This is the moment everything changed. Not because of a scandal, not because of a headline, but because the institutions that enable power, the banks, the regulators, the compliance officers, decided the risk was no longer worth it. And once that decision is made, once that infrastructure turns, the collapse isn't just possible, it's structural. We're watching the mechanics of accountability in real time. And whether you see this as justice or overreach, one thing is certain: the precedent is set. The question now is, who's next? Drop a comment below. Do you think financial infrastructure should play this kind of enforcement role, or does it cross a line? I want to hear your take. And if you want to stay ahead of these stories as they develop before the narrative solidifies, hit subscribe. This is where we break down how power actually moves. Thanks for watching.